So Thelema Mountain Vineyards have released their debut cultivar bottling of Grenache Noir, which is the 2022 vintage. And as I began to drink this wine, I started to think about Thelema's ethos. Because, at least in my mind, Thelema has always been about classic Stellenbosch. And for starters, they were founded by a classic. Giles Webb has been a hugely influential character that has shaped winemaking culture in Stellenbosch. Secondly, they've been around for over 40 years, so they're pretty much part of the furniture when it comes to Stellenbosch wine. And thirdly, even their most notable wines revolve around so-called classic cultivars like Cabernet Sauvignon and Chardonnay. So the question I've been asking myself is, why is a classic Stellenbosch estate dabbling with a Spanish cultivar like Grenache or Grenache? And sure, it is a noble cultivar, whatever that might mean, but is it really classic Stellenbosch?
That's a great question.
He's so smart.
As it turns out, Thelema have a powerfully persuasive answer to this question, which has really given me a new appreciation for Grenache Noir in the South African context. And really, once you've heard what I had to say on the matter, I think you'll agree that it becomes harder and harder to deny the fact that Grenache Noir is really one of South Africa's most underrated sleeping giants. Now, I don't say this only because of its growing importance as a drought-resistant cultivar in the increasingly dry Cape winelands, but also because of its remarkably long history in South Africa. And weirdly, this is a history that not many people really talk about. I mean, if we unpack South African wine in the major chapters, we start in the 1660s with Semillon, and then we kind of jump straight through to the 1800s and the sweet wines of Constantia. And from there, we head off to phylloxera and then the proliferation of Cinsault as a response to phylloxera. Even in modern times, it doesn't get a look in, because we have in the 20s the birth of Pinotage, then in the 50s the first bottling of Pinotage, then in the 90s the international recognition of Pinotage, and we've barely caught our breath from all the Pinotage before we have the Chenin Blanc revolution in the mid-90s to the turn of the millennium. But what we seldom acknowledge is that Grenache appears to have been quietly growing in South African soils for almost 3 centuries. Historian JOANNE Gibson does some absolutely fascinating Venus excavation on the wines of Citrusdal. Now, she did this work in order to try and prove that Napoleon had not only ordered sweet wines from Constantia, but had also ordered some sweet wines from Citrusdal. Wines which it seemed could well have been blends of Cinsault and Grenache. During her research, JOANNE uncovers some strong, albeit anecdotal, evidence that suggests that Grenache had been planted as far back as 1729. And just to give you some context, that is 150 years earlier than our oldest references to Cabernet Sauvignon being in the Cape. So from the outset, one has to acknowledge that Grenache appears to have a far richer and more entwined existence with South African wine history than perhaps one might have thought at first. But let's pause on Grenache history for a second and see how Thelema fit into the picture. For those of you not familiar with Thelema Mountain Vineyards, they are an insanely picturesque estate perched right up on the Stellenbosch side of the Simonsberg Mountain in a little region called Hellshoogte, which sounds like it should mean the heights of hell. Sadly, the actual translation is a little less pithy. It comes from the Dutch phrase Hoogte van die Heiling, or top of the slope. And while this translation is definitely less dramatic, it is far more accurate. Because really, some of Thelema's higher lying slopes sit up at a very impressive 535 meters above sea level. But aside from impressive altitude, there is also these regular cloud banks that move through and get trapped in the region. And these foothills, aside from just trapping clouds, also give the viticultural team at Thelema a broad range of aspects and slope angles with which to experiment. And really, it's this broad range of diverse slopes that has shaped the story of the Thelema Mountain Vineyards since the Webb family bought it back in 1983. The estate has become famous for its Bordeaux-styled Cabernet Sauvignons and its Burgundy-styled Chardonnays, but really, the golden thread that runs through it all is neither Bordeaux nor Burgundy, but rather it seems to be their relentless, insatiable desire to better themselves from vintage to vintage. Practically, this means prodding and poking every little corner of the property in order to find out what grows best. They then incrementally improve on that in the vineyards and in the cellar from vintage to vintage. And this is why fans of the estate can track the Thelema Cabernet Sauvignon, for example, back 40 vintages, because once they discover that they're onto something, they really don't let go. As a little side note, one of the most memorable bottles of South African wine that I've ever had was a then 31-year-old bottle of Cabernet Sauvignon from Thelema, which Giles Webb had submitted to the Cape Winemakers Guild. It was the 1990 Thelema Cabernet Sauvignon, an absolute masterpiece. But let's get back to Grenache. The Webb family first planted Grenache in the mid-2000s, and they've been working with the cultivar for almost 20 years. Now, they'd always been inspired by producers like Chateau Rayas from Châteauneuf-du-Pape, but simultaneously, they also had felt a little frustrated on the local front that almost all of the South African bottlings of Grenache seem to have been made in an excessively light style, almost to the point where, globally speaking, South African Grenache is distinct mostly for being so much lighter than any other style around the world. To understand this style of Grenache, one needs to look at South Africa's recent wine history, at least since the Swartland Revolution, which took place around 20 years ago. During that time, while there were some incredible advances made, it felt to a certain extent like some of our more progressive and objectively very highly skilled winemakers were in part operating out of a sort of overreaction to the rather gargantuan, sometimes awful, super ripe 15% icon style Bolshe wines that were coming out of South Africa at the turn of the millennium. So in one sense, the Swartland Revolution was the savior of South African wine and really put us back on the map. But in another sense, it triggered a whole set of quite emotional reactions to the status quo. And this in turn led to changes in winemaking style. So during that time, extraction of wines in the cellars plummeted. The ripeness at time of harvest plummeted. The use of new oak in the cellar plummeted. And really, the minimalist style of winemaking was suddenly very much in vogue. And it was this lighter, more delicate aesthetic that really opened the way for a rediscovery of all those old Cinsault vineyards that we were talking about in the 1900s. Now, Cinsault as a cultivar has very low color intensity. But hey, so does Grenache. And so along with those old vine Cinsauts were a whole bunch of Grenache wines that came into the fray. Not least of all, the old vine Grenache, which came from places like the Pinotage Kloof that we mentioned in Joanne Gibson's Historical Sleuthing. And so collectively, all these shifts in winemaking style led to a sort of cultural snowball that really revolved around a sort of competition to see who could make the lightest, most minimal wines possible. Some of which were and still are absolutely incredible. But the downside to all of this was that along the way, partially because of its light color, people forgot that Grenache wines are actually capable of incredible power. As I mentioned earlier, South African Grenache seems to be distinct purely for how light and delicate it can be, and they are delicious. But I think this aesthetic is based less in some deep truth about Grenache as a cultivar and more in the winemaking aesthetic of a specific period in history. This all in turn brings us back to Thelema and their pursuit of the classic and their experimentation with Grenache. We've already established that Grenache's history is far longer than many of our most classic cultivars, and really an enduring history in a place is surely at least one part of any claim to classicism. But we acknowledge also that Grenache has perhaps been hijacked by a sort of trend of the time. Now, Thelema, for their part, have never been about trends of the time. In fact, quite the opposite. They've always been about trying to deliver something far more enduring in style than something that embraces a transient trend. Which is, ironically, why it's quite exciting to discover that the wine in the bottle is very different to most of the South African Grenaches that had been released in the last little while. The first thing I noticed, aside from the slightly deeper sense of color, is some really rather arresting structure. They seem to have managed to attain a certain level of power in this wine, but without losing those prettier elements that come from some of South Africa's lighter Grenaches. And you'll see these pretty fruit elements working really nicely against some really rather firm tannins. So when you sip on it, you're reminded of just how grand those Grenache-led blends can be from regions like Châteauneuf-du-Pape or from Spain's Priorat. But beyond what's in the glass, I think what really excites me is the potential for this new avenue of Grenache, where viticulture and enology can work together to explore the more muscly side of Grenache Noir. So when you manage to track this wine down, I would love to hear your thoughts on Thelema's interpretation of Grenache Noir. And I've left 2 video links which cover other South African Grenaches so that you can dig a little bit deeper into what the cultivar is doing in the dynamic South African wine mix.